Hello, I'm James Foster, Director of the Institute for International Economic Policy of the George Washington University, welcoming you to a series of short conversations with faculty affiliates on the COVID-19 crisis. Today I'm speaking with Steve Hamilton, Assistant Professor in the Department of Economics at GW and visiting scholar at the Tax and Transfer Policy Institute of the Australian National University, who has been very busy formulating and influencing COVID-19 economic policy the last few weeks. Steve, as I see it, you've been instrumental in ensuring that the policy responses in at least two countries, the US and Australia, included measures for small and medium-sized businesses and their workers. Let's begin with the US. Why the focus on small businesses? And what steps did you take to help make better policy?
G'day, James. Good to be with you today. So, in a normal recession, we can usually rely on cash stimulus to pump the economy back up, right? You give consumers cash stimulus, they go out and spend it. That helps to support businesses and then the jobs of workers in those businesses through the crisis. So normally we just want to push a whole lot of cash into the economy, pump aggregate demand back up and try and lean against the recession. The problem with COVID-19 is it generates a very, very unusual recession. So the government, rather than having the economy collapse, the government has deliberately shut down whole sectors of the economy. And because of that, demand in those sectors is constrained. And there's no amount of cash stimulus that we could push into the economy to prop demand back up again. In fact, we wouldn't want to do that, right? It's the right thing that these sectors are shut so that we can protect the public health, right? But the problem with that, it means that there's no way for us to get support to businesses and to their workers, right, through cash stimulus. So the idea behind supporting small business is to kind of kill two birds with one stone. On one hand, you support the businesses to keep them afloat through the crisis, right? So that on the other side of the crisis, we don't have a decimated, small business sector and therefore, decimated jobs on the other side of the crisis coming out. But the second thing is if you support small businesses in a way that encourages them to keep on workers and encourages them to pay those workers a wage through the crisis, you also support the workers directly. You support their incomes to help them get through. So that kind of serves the same purpose that in a normal recession a fiscal stimulus would. So in the US and in a lot of other countries, we're seeing a lot of policies that provide support to small businesses contingent on keeping workers on and contingent on continuing to pay workers. And I think that is the right sort of solution to this very unusual economic calamity that we find ourselves in.
This relief bill, in fact, pair of relief bills that recently passed in the US, included significant provisions for small businesses. Mm-hmm. How happy were you with this result? And is more needed?
Yes, so they passed a bill of about $350 billion. It's called the Paycheck Protection Program. And the idea behind this program is if you're a small business in America, and that means a business with fewer than 500 employees, they give you a loan, the government gives you a loan worth 2.5 months of your payroll, all of the payroll in a previous year. They hand you that money up front. Now, if for 8 weeks through the crisis, you maintain your staffing levels at the previous year and you don't cut salaries by more than 25%, then the government agrees to waive that loan in full. So essentially, the government is covering 2 months of your payroll plus some other expenses that you might have. So it's a very large subsidy to these businesses. I think that's exactly the right approach. In fact, it's consistent with the recommendations that me and a colleague of mine, Stan Voiger at the American Enterprise Institute, recommended prior to them introducing. But it's not perfect, right? There are some problems. So one problem is the policy is not very well targeted, right? So ideally, you would target this policy at the businesses who really needed it, the businesses experiencing a really large drop in their revenues. But instead, it sort of is going to go to a much larger group of businesses, right? So businesses who don't really need it, and there are a whole lot of loopholes in the law, meaning that some businesses who are sort of larger than 500 employees are getting this. The second big problem is the funding for the plan was radically inadequate. So to cover 2.5 months payroll of every small business in America, you need around $600 billion, right? They funded the scheme with $350 billion. So it was at least half the money they needed to fully fund the scheme. And then you take into account the fact that there are all of these loopholes, so a lot more firms will fall under this umbrella than we would like, and there's just nowhere near enough money. So what we saw, which wasn't a surprise, although I was surprised of the speed, was all of the money ran out in 2 weeks. $350 billion of small business support ran out in 2 weeks. And that only helped 1 million, of the 6 million American small businesses. So, I think they're proposed to do more, and I think more is going to be needed.
I can see. Now, moving on to the international arena, I understand that Australia passed a relief bill that would subsidize closed businesses also for, that retain their employees during the crisis. And that is that provision that you suggested last March. What's the timeline, leading from your talking about it in that paper to it happening in fact?
It was, the age of COVID-19, things move quickly, right? Yeah. So I was calling for this in the US very loudly. We were talking to people in Congress and policymakers about this, and thankfully the US government moved quite quickly. The Australian government was announcing closing the border, so I left the US for Australia just before they closed the border. I was writing an opinion piece in the leading financial newspaper in the country, and that was on Wednesday of a certain week that opinion piece landed, and it was very well received and very widely publicized. At that point, the government had ruled out any support on this basis. 5 days later, the government stood up and announced a $130 billion wage subsidy. So things move very, very quickly in this environment, and what that highlights, I think, is the importance of professional economists to move quickly, to have their advice heard by policymakers, because they are going to act regardless. So it's very important that they act with our advice in mind.
Many people that I know, I've been talking to a bunch of folks, are fearful of the economic fallout from the crisis.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice on how to minimize the negative impacts? In particular, why not simply open up to avoid a serious recession? Why don't we just open up?
Right. This is being called for in some quarters. I'm very, very worried about this. So I organized an open letter in the last few days with a group of 275 eminent Australian economists that makes exactly the opposite recommendation, that opening up the economy too soon would in fact be a false economy, right? Most people think opening up the economy will help the economy, right? But if we open up the economy and the disease is allowed to spread, and as we can see, it spreads very rapidly like wildfire, then that in the end will be counterproductive. The economic capacity will be diminished by that, right? If there's a contagion ripping through the population, people are going to be very afraid, right? They're not going to want to go out and spend. They're not going to want to go to work, right? And what we worry about is that leads to an even larger contraction. So the way I think about it is that these lockdowns, right, they actually preserve economic capacity. They don't diminish it, right? They protect the economy from the disease so that once the disease is under control and we have the appropriate public health measures in place, we can progress with a staged loosening of these requirements in a way that maintains public health, but also ensures that these sectors are kind of able to come back. Now, the big caveat to that, of course, is we want to ensure adequate fiscal support. So if we decide to shut down certain parts of the economy, which we should do for public health, then the government has to step up and fill the gap in economic activity. I've been heartened by what the government in the US and Australia has done to date, but it's clear they're going to need to do a lot more.
Well, thank you very much for talking with us today. That was Professor Stephen Hamilton with a brief conversation on his work on COVID-19. I'm James Foster. See you soon for another Institute conversation.